Yes, love's a secret weapon. Yeah!
Hi, I'm Donna Loren.
And I'm Dr. Adam Gerace.
And you are listening to Love's a Secret Weapon podcast.
Hi, I'm Donna Loren. Many words can describe Dr. Pepper. Here's how our caveman friends do it.
Now that you all have a bottle of Dr. Pepper, I want you to take a taste and then give me your reaction in one word. Remember now, one word. Flavor. Lift.
Light!
Lively. Zonk.
The soft drink with zonk? Well, that's one way to praise Dr. Pepper. Here's mine. Good times begin with Dr. Pepper. Distinctively different Dr. Pepper. Not a cola or a root beer, a light and lively taste that you cheer. The lift is great, the flavor fine, it's Dr. Pepper time.
Welcome back to our podcast, and today we continue Chapter 12, New Love. Donna, it's nice to be back with you.
Always, Adam. And back from the honeymoon, as we were talking, right?
That's right. In the previous episode, you had gotten married and gone on your honeymoon to Hawaii. And so where we're at now is really your return. And so I'm interested, before we do invite our listeners in to hear about life post the wedding, how was it moving out of your parents' home or your home in Grandview Boulevard and into your new home?
Oh, a breath of fresh air, honestly. It's exactly what this girl needed. And I'm sure lots and lots of people feel that way, you know, that there just comes a time in your life where you need a change. And where I moved, it was just enchanting. It was in a canyon above Sunset Boulevard, and it was very kind of bohemian, and you know, it was a totally different change. Felt like you know, being surrounded in nature, and really gave me an environment of a lot of creativity. And actually, it was kind of convenient for my new husband to drive to his Warner Brothers office. And and so it was actually very, very positive.
Fantastic. And was it a new home or an older building?
Well, it was pretty new. It was actually a triplex, kind of, what do you call that? Like 3 levels.
Yep.
And the top were the bedrooms, and the middle section was the kitchen and dining, and then a very 60s style, you know, step down into a living room area with a big fireplace and windows out to the view of the canyon.
That sounds great, and definitely very 60s in its look, depending on when it was built.
Totally. Well, that was 1968, and I would venture to say that we purchased it probably from the original owner, but I can't swear to that.
And, you know, I think we've all, as you said, we've all had house moves before, and just starting afresh, sometimes that seemed like it was a pretty pristine house. Sometimes if it isn't, as we've spoken about before, you burn a little sage, or you do what you need to do.
Well, I have to say that if I still had that house, and I'm sure many, many people feel this way, if they had just kept the property that they started with many years ago, that would be an incredible investment and probably a great place to go back and visit.
It's interesting, isn't it, that we make these choices, or we need to make these choices, you know, based on life and everything else. And I'm certainly noticing the neighborhood that we live in is changing sort of as we speak, that old houses are getting bought up and knocked down, and, you know, multiple houses are being put up. And it's just that question of, you know, when do you enter the market or exit the market, or whatever else. But these houses hold a lot of memories, as I'm sure that one does.
Oh, definitely.
Well, we're going to continue the reading today, but we thank, as always, our listeners for comments either at our email address, podcast@donnaloren.net, or on social media. I've just got one about the recent episode from Michael Austin, who often comments on our episodes and is an avid listener. So thank you, Michael, for always letting us know what you think. And for the previous episode, you said, another great episode. Someone's getting married. I relate so much to your early home life. Thank you. So thank you for that, Michael.
Hello, Michael, and yes, thank you very much.
Excellent. And so should we take it away? Would you like to continue Chapter 12, New Love?
Yes.
Go, Donna.
On May 18th, less than 2 months after my wedding, I was on a trip with Maury to Omaha, Nebraska for Dr. Pepper. A family there who owned the local Dr. Pepper franchise were very friendly and had entertained me at their home. I'd listened to their son play drums in their family room, and on that visit, I'd noticed the town was divided by railroad tracks, demarcating clearly the wrong side as the poor neighborhood. Our car passed over the tracks, moving up a hill to where the family lived, obviously the right side of the tracks. I remember a few years after I saw a report that 60 Minutes did on Lena Horne, somebody who I really admired. During the interview, she went back to the South where she was originally from, and next to the railroad tracks, she stood on one side, looking over to the other where she had come from. Her foot could not move to cross the tracks. It was like her whole will of survival and of what she had created wouldn't allow her to even cross into the past. Miss Horne just couldn't physically do it. It was too emotional for her. It was very impactful for me. I still have a similar reaction when I think about going back to Grandview Boulevard. That family had gifted me with a cookbook for my wedding, and this time they had asked me to entertain at one of their events. I couldn't let them down, and so I went. Shortly after, we checked into our hotel room. The phone rang, and Maury answered it. It was Lenny. He passed the phone to me that was placed on a dimly lit dresser where my image was reflected in a mirror on the wall. My heart sank when I heard Lenny's voice. It was shaking, and he demanded, "Get home now. My mother is dying." I turned to Maury and I said, "I have to leave now. Lenny's mother's in the hospital and she's dying." Maury's reaction was to fix his eyes on me with assertion and tell me that I could leave after I had kept my commitment to Dr. Pepper. His lack of compassion startled me. I can comprehend a commitment of responsibility and had always done so, but his ethics here wouldn't compute. I'm 21 and a married woman. My husband's mother is dying. I'm leaving now, I jolted back. He complied with great reluctance. On the plane ride back to LA, I reflected on the news I had just received. Only 2 weeks before, I had been on the phone with my mother, writing down her chicken soup recipe to bring to my mother-in-law, Jeanette, while she lay in bed at her home, ill. When I arrived at Sierra Towers, I went directly to her kitchen to serve her a bowl of freshly made soup. I helped her eat it, spooning warm broth into her mouth. She showed me warmth and gratitude in her dazed condition. She gathered up enough strength to ask me a question. "Did you ever read Spinoza?" That was out of left field and very bizarre, I thought. What I was witnessing was a woman who loved literacy and was educated and sophisticated. In her feverish condition, she wanted me to know that side of her. Spinoza. I immediately drove to the Bodhi tree on Melrose Avenue and purchased a book by the 17th century Dutch philosopher. The plane landed at LAX, and I'm not clear if I drove myself or exactly how I got to Cedars of Lebanon on Sunset Boulevard, where Lenny's mom lay dying. My vivid recall is that the first thing I saw after exiting the elevator was the sight of a woman's hand, freshly manicured, hanging off the side of a bed in an open doorway. Her hand. Lenny's sister, Roz, rushed over to me in a frenzy. I stood frozen in this scene of a family gathered outside the hospital room of their loved one. She said, "You're 10 minutes too late. My mother's dead." She instructed me to go to Lenny. It was though my obedient behavior with my own family kicked in, and I followed her order. He stood shocked as I approached him. This all happened so suddenly to all of us. But I was the newest member of the family. I barely knew his mother. I reached out to hold him and lay my head on his shoulder and began to cry. I felt ill-equipped to handle this situation. Feelings of alienation ran through my veins. It was like entering a void. 2 days later was the funeral. May it be with the blessing of the Waronker family that I share my experience. In the morning, Lenny told me that the limo with his father, sister, and brother-in-law Arthur would arrive at noon. A strong impulse came over me to go to Robinson's for a pair of stockings I could wear to the funeral. I knew it opened at 10 a.m., and from our house in Beverly Glen, it would only take 10 minutes each way to drive, and I knew exactly what I wanted. I told Lenny that I had to buy a pair of stockings, and I would be back in time. I left. Upon returning in my Stingray, I drove up to find the limo waiting. Lenny was already in the car with his family. "Get in, we'll be late," he said sternly. I entered the limo with his family. I sat next to Arthur on the seat by the window. Cy, Lenny's dad, announced to all of us instructions not to cry. Something was triggered in me, and my reflex turned on a waterfall of tears. I was so confused by their ways. Arthur comforted me while Lenny, his sister, and father sat composed. I cried until the driver turned to tell us that he thought he was lost. My tears turned to tears of laughter along with the other members of the limo. Somehow, the limo driver was lost in the parking lot of Robinson's department store in Beverly Hills, the same place I went to for my stockings just a little while ago. Roz spoke up. "This is my mother's favorite place to shop. Just recently, I went shopping with her for stockings." For now, we all had a good laugh over the timely errors of our driver. I had some feelings of guilt. When Lenny's mother was still alive, she visited me at our house to bring me a wedding gift. She was dressed in a little finely tailored black and white suit. The sound of her gold charm bracelet jingled as she moved her gloves. She placed the package in my entryway and proceeded to remove her jacket, roll up the sleeves of her crisp white silk blouse. "Open it," she said. I did. A vacuum cleaner. "Oh, thank you," I said, and I hugged her frail body, careful not to crush her fragile skeletal frame. She smelled sweet, unlike my mother. This was a trait I instantly adopted and thanked Jeanette for teaching me how to be a lady. Before my eyes, she began disassembling the vacuum cleaner. "This is how you do it," she told me. "Now you'll never need to call a repairman." Oh my God, how could I ever live up to this woman? Did my thoughts influence her leaving? A mountain of cascading flowers in white graced her memorial service. Her death had a devastating effect on so many people. Her husband, my father-in-law, Cy, decided to sell their property and bought a yacht. Too many years of close bond with his wife required a dramatic change with her loss. In his 70-foot boat manned by a captain and a small crew, he spent his first year grieving, traveling the world. When he returned, he took me aside and told me that when he was passing through the Panama Canal, he saw me sing on the Milton Berle show. Alfred Newman, a close friend of the family, visited Cy at his home one day before his departure when I was there as well. Cy played first violin for the orchestra at Fox in the mid-30s, where Alfred composed and conducted great movie themes like Wuthering Heights. The Newman family and the Waronkers were extremely close. All who attended showed reverence for the departed I had never experienced before. Jeanette had touched lives in a way I grew to admire. I inherited several heirlooms from her that have taken on a life of their own. I cherish them along with heirlooms from other family members. I always dreamed of emulating my mother's story. Get married at 21, have your first child at 22. Her fictitious fantasy became my reality. When my mother-in-law passed away so suddenly early in my marriage, an enormous void occurred. In my mind, only a baby could fill this void. I was still completely committed to my responsibilities to Dr. Pepper and traveling for them, doing franchise bottling plant openings and performing. The toll on my marriage was growing. Every time I packed my bags to go, my husband displayed resentment. My calculations and memory tell me that sometime in September of 1968, 6 months into my marriage, I became pregnant. I had the typical symptoms of morning sickness and the urges and cravings to eat raw coconut and fresh raspberries, as well as salami sandwiches at 7 a.m. So specific to my cravings was the challah bread I bought at Nate and Al's Deli for these early morning pig-outs. Indulgences like these were the first signs of joy I experienced in my early stages of pregnancy. Off to Saks Fifth Avenue to purchase appropriate attire, it was almost like a performance state of mind, not a practical decision to buy maternity clothes. I needed to look the part. My first acquisition was a Jackie O A-line wool dress in baby blue with a matching coat. As soon as I knew I was pregnant, I had announced it to my parents. One morning I received a call from Maury. It was one of those rare calls from him that never resonated with me. He went into a spiel about me having a baby and how I could work 60% of the time and be a mom 40% of the time. He never asked me if this was what I wanted, and my reply to him was absolute. I'm raising my child 100% of the time. I want the baby to know who his mother is. There was no hostility in my voice, just a firm no to his incessant control over me. It was like talking Greek to Maury. He couldn't fathom my wishes, only his own. I knew I would have the support of my husband in this decision. Soon after, Lenny and I had an appointment with our new business manager, Larry Stern. Larry inquired about my career, and he said that our combined incomes would result in a certain amount of taxes. What are you going to do about your income, he asked me. In typical form, I replied, give it to my parents. All of it, he exclaimed. Yes, I said. That's the way it's always been.
Wow, listening to that reading of the death of your mother-in-law and the funeral, I mean, even now I can see that or hear that the emotion is still there as it would be when anyone passes, particularly, I guess, for the family, someone who was relatively young at the time. I mean, Lenny lost his mother at quite a young age, and just that dynamic that comes from a time of a funeral, particularly when perhaps you have a certain relationship with the person who's died, but also there's considering how the family feels and your place in the family. It's a really complicated dynamic.
Oh, yes, Adam. May I recline on your sofa?
Please do.
The word unresolved really rings out to me. It just feels like the whole entire experience came out with this feeling of no resolution. It reminds me of, not being able to say I love you or say your goodbyes to someone and hoping that they know on some level that you love them and that you care and that you'll always be thinking about them. And because I barely knew Jeanette, but I felt her empathy and I felt that there was some sort of a bond that I really looked forward to having. It was like an immediate emptiness and just a tremendous shock, which, as I was saying, the only thing I could think of was to transition into becoming a mother and maybe pulling those drawstrings a little closer in with Lenny to help him with the loss of his mother.
And certainly when there are these more unexpected or untimely deaths, there's often a bit more of a complex grief as well. I mean, not that I think anyone's necessarily prepared, but there are different types of passings. And in the case of this one, often that more complex or complicated grief that's often written about is a difficult one to process, both in this case for the children of Jeanette, and it can lead to a range of different things, whether people don't want to talk about the person who's passed away because it is painful and very complex, or in the case of yourself or even Cy, this idea of making changes, whether in his case it was because he couldn't be in the environment he had been in, or perhaps where in your case values change often after someone passes, where even though you were beginning or already sort of having this shift in priority as you were getting married and becoming 21. And I do kind of wonder if this was a bit of a catalyst to make some further changes, because there was a consciously or unconsciously a reassessment of what your values were and what you wanted.
Yes. Well, now you just gave me like a trunk full of thoughts that kind of helped me reflect when I lost my grandfather, at a very young age. And, anytime and then the death of Kennedy, so suddenly, and being virtually there, when that occurred, and they all seem like a tragedy. Well, I have to say, to bring it into the present, that, death is a part of life, and the circumstances are all so unique. But the passing of a loved one it just brings to mind, the heart connection that you never lose, and the impression they made on you to be a better person or to learn from. So I've really grown, into having these experiences of death and seeing it much, much differently now than I did then, because it was all so chaotic and emotional. And as I say, this lack of resolve, it felt like. But yes, to know that new life was coming, and that I had to look forward to having a child and making that commitment and standing up to my dad when I thought his demand was beyond, it's just beyond.
There's a level, we've spoken about this before, that priority of work and some of the situations you experienced over that period of working for Dr. Pepper and doing other things, when, that ability to be human or to relate to something in a way that wasn't all about business was often curtailed. People were like, no, you're doing this, whether it was after Kennedy got shot or other situations you were exposed to. And to have that, I guess, firm response, but very fair response, I think showed a lot of, although I'm sure it was in the moment, it did show a lot of courage, given there was so much of that previous conditioning into this way of doing things. And, I'm just reflecting on, as you were doing the reading, that even at funerals at very sad times, there can be ridiculous or kind of funny situations, such as getting lost in the same department store.
That's not an accident.
That's the thing. And given the connection as well that Jeanette had to it, these interesting little situations that happen. But, I of course know the story, but I think I'm really interested, even just hearing it now, to hear about what happened next.
Thank you very much, and I shall continue. In that moment, it became crystal clear to me that I needed to make a radical change in my life. I'm married and expecting a child. My husband can provide for us and is willing. My parents have had a stranglehold over me until now. It was time to stop. I left that meeting with Larry knowing that I had to take action. When I was home alone, I picked up the phone and dialed the number of the CEO of Dr. Pepper, W.W. Foots Clemens. He greeted me cheerfully with his southern drawl. "Hello, Donna," he said warmly. I told him I was expecting a child and that the sudden loss of my mother-in-law had made an impact on my marriage. He asked me if I was happy. I told him that I was, and that I was truly looking forward to being a mother. Silence on the other end. I continued by saying that I felt committed to raising my child and that my marriage supported me in that opportunity. Therefore, I would no longer want to work for Dr. Pepper at this time. He reacted with, "Well, dear, we were thinking of discussing changes in your life with you anyway. We understand and wish you and your child a good life." Essentially, I had taken my life back with this bold action. I drove to my parents' house to tell them of my conversation. It was afternoon when I drove up to 3628 Grandview and saw Maury, shirtless, holding a garden hose, watering the front lawn. I got out of my Corvette and recounted my talk with Foots. Maury dropped the hose, the water flailing like a serpent. "You gave up the rest of the money in your DP contract? What are we going to do now?" His emotions were like those of a child, and he started sobbing. I got back into my car. He didn't try talking to me. He just stood there, helpless. Maybe in this moment my dad realized he relinquished all control over me. I never even made it into the house to tell my mom. Thank God I was spared from that nightmare. I knew I wasn't leaving my parents high and dry. After all, Maury was 45 years veteran of animation with a pension. It turned out that he would return to work for a short time to receive that. I had never even asked him for any money during my work except for my cars. At 21, when I received my trust fund that was set aside by court-approved contractual agreements, I gave it all to my family.
Wow, there's really so much in this retelling of all those events over those several months. But I'm really interested to ask about that decision making in that moment to go directly to Foots Clements, and what influenced you to go directly to the CEO of Dr. Pepper in that moment.
You know, it just came so natural. That after that meeting with Larry Stern, our new business manager, and the point that he made, this is before, obviously, I've explained that, much, much later in my life, I discovered that Dr. Pepper had made an arrangement with Maury and Ruth so that none of that money belonged to me, just a small portion that was set aside.
Outrageous.
All of that money that came in that I worked for, was consumed by them and never even showed up as something that I earned, so that later in my life I could be compensated duly.
Yeah.
So it was in that moment, and I think Larry Stern and Lenny sat in support of me being able to think on my feet and be rational. And, for whatever it's worth, in the 60s, with the dynamic of the gender inequality, in that moment, I received a tremendous amount of respect from both my husband and our business manager. And I think that was the power or the impetus that gave me the will, to just take action. And take action I did.
Yeah, and did it feel, and I guess in many ways there was so many times during your career and so many times when we have spoken on the podcast about decisions that were made, sometimes out of desperation. Did it feel then like an empowering decision? You've called it a logical decision. Did it feel like an empowering decision, or did it feel like it had come from that decision born of some desperation, I guess?
I keep thinking that it was a moment of liberation. And certainly being a wife and my honeymoon experience, I
Mm.
mean, I really wasn't into thinking that my life was empowered
Mm.
necessarily.
Mm.
And I wasn't acting, desperate. So I just think that something in me from the very beginning, my soul came into this body,
Mm.
wanted freedom.
Mm. Mm.
And I've been a very soft-spoken freedom fighter my whole life. And really that's the most precious thing to me.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I can relate to those situations where you do make that decision and you're able to make that decision and take whatever power there is. And of course, there is an effect and a result of that. And it does take time to process that. It's not as if we do these things and then, great, that's done and dusted. But it does begin to allow you to see those parts of freedom or those parts of liberation that you can have, because I kind of think also it was born of that very logical decision making in that moment, and certainly as a young adult you made that decision as well. But I almost wonder, I couldn't imagine a situation where you would have been able to go to your parents and kind of break that, for want of a better term, contract with them that you had from the time you were 7 years old and they sat you at the dinner
Yes.
table for a business meeting, and that was your contract with them. And certainly times when you tried to, in this early married life, tried to see if there could be a different way, I don't think that was going to be listened to.
Well, one thing they could never take away from me is my love of singing.
Mm. Mm.
And, that was one of the first things that I did, is supply myself with an old upright piano I found in a church,
Mm.
and put it in our new little living room. And, when I had time and I made time, that to me is something, no one can ever take away from me.
Mm.
Is my love of singing. And it's interesting, Adam, in making thoughtful decisions,
Mm.
that maybe get stretched out over a period of time, or, so to speak, acting impulsively,
Mm.
but not really, because you've reached this crescendo in your life where, it just, all the pieces fit. And that's kind of what happened to me, and I'm ever so grateful for it.
Yeah, I think you're very right that even if it does look like an impulsive behavior, if someone would go, wow, that's a big move to just do that and finish up and cut the cord there. As you said, it's often born of a series of processes. And however aware we are at the time, it kind of leads us to that, and we make that decision to do so. Or at least in my experience, that's certainly been the case. And,
There
you
you
know,
go.
mm,
So in essence, you really have to trust yourself, and even if you goof, a bit,
mm.
essentially, if you're true to yourself, you will land on your feet.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because you said, as you said, that even though you were letting go of this part of your career, there was still, of course, that love of singing that wasn't tied into the career. That was something that you were born with or experienced very early in life. And so you did continue that. And I know as we go forward in the podcast, we're going to talk more about that. But I'm interested in terms of the Dr. Pepper situation, because that was such a big part of your life from 1963 to 1968, about, I guess, leaving that, because that was your day-to-day work in addition to everything else you did, how busy you were. And I know that you had some contact with the Dr. Pepper company later on, in the early 80s, particularly with Harry Ellis, who was one of the board members and eventually I think became the Dr. Pepper historian and wrote a wonderful history of the company, called Dr. Pepper, King of Beverages. But was there any other contact after that with any of these people that you had worked so closely with? I mean, people like Foots, who you had worked closely with over that period of time.
There was some correspondence, but essentially the chapter was closed.
Mm.
And as I said, even at my wedding, I didn't find my mother sending an invitation to anyone
Mm.
that that traveled with me or worked, part of the board of directors, some of the vice presidents, the CEO. She had 40 extra invitations. She could have dispersed a few to them.
She could have had the whole board there if she wanted.
She could have. But as time went on, and I'm not trying to make light of it, but when I worked for Dr. Pepper, it was based, the headquarters were in Dallas.
Yes.
They were an American company.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't know exactly when it started changing, but they became more corporate. They were purchased by other companies and, and it was no longer I'm going to just use a term, boutique kind of a situation. And that changes the environment, and people really get lost in the cracks. But as time goes by, it's so funny how, because I was the only Dr. Pepper girl, that there's this cycle of reminiscence that keeps occurring, where people really are fond of the beverage and they love the idea that there was someone representing them. And it happened to be a teenager, maybe when they were kids, maybe they weren't even born, but they kind of like that idea. So it lives on.
It's not just a soft drink. It's the only soft drink of its kind. And so therefore, it's hard to sell. We used to have to prepare them for it because we say, now this looks like a cola, but it's not like cola. It doesn't have any cola in it. They say, well, what is it? I said, I don't know. They said, what's in it? I said, I don't know what's in it. The only way you can find out what's in it is to drink one.
And that's interesting. I was reading a really great interview with Foots from, I think it was 1975, so a few years afterwards, after what we're talking about. And it was in a magazine called D Magazine, which is a magazine from Dallas, Fort Worth. And it's interesting that he was certainly the face of the company in many ways. And he talks about, his day essentially consisted of 4 hot Dr. Peppers in the morning and half a dozen cold ones in the afternoon. Unless he does something, gets quite active during the day, and then he has to drink more of them. But the interesting part of that interview, because that was really at the time when they were talking about really trying to continue to break into that national market, which had really occurred during the 60s when you were working for them, that move towards that. But he sort of spoke about Dr. Pepper's approach, and you called it that boutique approach. But he really talked about the approach of Dr. Pepper in forming personal relationships. And that could be with bottling plant owners, later with supermarkets, whatever it was. And I think that really sums up what your role was as the Dr. Pepper girl in identifying yourself in those commercials where you say your name at the beginning. You formed personal relationships with people during that time.
I can only hope that when John Lennon discovered Dr. Pepper and started shipping cases of it over, if you look at the film that he does when he's performing Imagine by his white piano, he always has a Dr. Pepper right there. And dear friends of mine, Todd and David, who are documentary movie producers, did one on Cher and told me that she uses Dr. Pepper to warm up her voice.
Love it.
So yeah, Doctor may not have a period after it to make it official, but there is some sort of, healing quality that many people just absolutely love. And, it's a form of addiction, obviously, if there's caffeine. And some people are totally committed to Coca-Cola, and some people are whatever works, right?
Well, that's exactly it. That, you were living your life and raising a family, but, I think we do, and I do want to say that your legacy at Dr. Pepper during that time should not be understated. Being the face of Dr. Pepper for the national set, or the younger national set, at that time, the company was moving from being a regional or, I guess, southern drink to taking on that national market. And I think you've mentioned this a little bit, but how did you view your work with Dr. Pepper once you left in that more immediate aftermath? And has that changed over time?
That's a very interesting question. I had so many cultural experiences through working with Dr. Pepper.
Mm.
You know, we started out just at the beginning of the British invasion,
Mm.
and the whole civil rights movement was happening. The government, you know, the politics in this country were so revolutionary. So the ability to travel, the ability to connect with people on a one-on-one, to see this country, you know,
Mm.
and the various aspects of this country just firsthand, was incredible. I mean, that's something that everyone would love to do in their lives, if possible, is to travel. You know, it's been said that it's probably the best education one can
Mm.
receive.
Mm.
You know, that you definitely have your senses heightened, you know, with the different flavors and smells of the foods that people eat, and then the dialects, and even if it's the same language, you know, you go to one
Mm.
county and, you know, and the language is completely sounding totally different,
Mm.
and it's colorful, and it's like a rainbow, and then you see the commonality, you know, because everyone essentially wants to be loved and wants to show love, and so that just continued in my life, regardless of, you know, working for Dr. Pepper or not. Whenever I traveled beyond that, not, you know, trying to paint a picture that everything was rosy.
Mm.
Life is not perfect, but I just feel that whatever I contributed to Dr. Pepper, I continued contributing to the lives that I touched, and
Mm.
certainly the lives that touched me.
Absolutely. And do you think perhaps then, and you talk about so much of this and so much of the past 2 seasons of this podcast, we've spoken about those times that you experienced as with Dr. Pepper, but with other life-changing experiences such as Shindig. But you talk about the civil rights movement, the British invasion, the Vietnam War, and veterans from that war, Kennedy's assassination, of course, when you were being introduced as the Dr. Pepper girl, those 5 years earlier in Dallas. Do you think that's your legacy then, that connection with people that you took forward?
Oh, I just, yeah, I don't even know if it's a legacy, but I just think it's how I came out, and as we touched on briefly, you know, I really look forward to continuing conversations about life, with fans who have been so lovely and following me for all these years, or maybe even more recently. And I look forward to inviting one by one to include them in our discussions from here on.
Absolutely. And as you said, you know, so many people have followed you either more recently or over, you know, many, many, many years. And I know that even once you left the public eye, you still heard from fans. People would still contact you. And I think you even had little photo cards that you'd still send out if someone wanted one.
That's right.
You know, and if anyone is listening that was at one of the bottling openings or something like that, get in contact with us. You know, email us at podcast@donnaloren.net, because we've spoken about so much of that great, you know, connection with so many people in those bottling plant openings and other appearances and so on. And now we're also talking on that one-to-one connection between us, but between you and your listeners and people who have followed you. And I'm sure many people probably ask you, you know, what did you do after you left the public eye? And as you said, we're going to invite our listeners into this over our episodes going forward. But for now, I think you're going to end with telling us a little bit about those immediate months after you left Dr. Pepper and put that part of your life to one side.
I reveled in the fact that I was pregnant. As my stomach grew, I was enraptured by the feeling of life growing inside me. For the first time in my life, I was feeling free, albeit for the nagging pressure that I wasn't pleasing my parents and was letting down the machine that fueled my career. But this time, guilt was not in charge. Now I would be able to do what every parent has an opportunity to do: give their child what they did not have. In my case, let's start with unconditional love. I couldn't wait to meet my new little companion and learn about who he or she was. Thought of discovering what the likes and dislikes of this child would be was so exciting to me. I had a lot of support from Lenny's sister, Roz, with whom I am still friends. We met in 1967, and she made me a baby shower in her new home in Encino. It's crazy, but my palate reminds me of the grapes she integrated into her chicken salad. Simply divine. After my experience of morning sickness, a short 6 weeks after queasiness, I met with my friend Deirdre, who had recently moved into the neighborhood. She was the girlfriend of Sal Valentino, Lenny's friend and artist. Deirdre told me of a gourmet market not far away in Westwood. I visited the market called Jurgensen's and realized something was gravely missing from my life: fresh, seasonal food. My mother, being a post-World War II homemaker, generally served frozen or canned vegetables. Her idea of fresh was iceberg lettuce and cantaloupe on the same table. Maury, on the other hand, had a love of the garden and grew fruit trees and strawberries. He always spoke of his father, Ben, doing the same and taking the family to Orange County to pick fruit in season: apricots, plums, peaches, cherries. Those were a few of his favorites. When I strolled down each aisle of Jurgensen's array of fresh vegetables and fruit, it was like being on a world tour. Strawberries from New Zealand, Kentucky limestone lettuce with a bit of soil at its base, russet potatoes and golden Yukons that were picture perfect, Roman beauty apples and navel oranges the size of your face. I was learning names of these varieties, which gave grocery shopping an entirely new experience and appreciation. Down another aisle were copper cookware from France and fresh roasted coffee grounds to your liking. I was elevated in a way I could relate to when I would walk into a recording studio with a group of musicians and feel lifted as though I was floating above the floor. Walnuts and almonds in their shells with very cool nutcrackers, although I prefer the basic ones that can also be used to open a stubborn jar lid. It seemed that this market had so many personal touches and everyone was so friendly. This new world that my friend Deirdre opened up for me became a surrogate family. Harry, an elderly fellow with white hair and glasses, greeted me. "Hello and welcome to Jurgensen's. We're proud of our home-baked goods. Would you like to try one?" He led me over to the case of goodies that would become my family's staples. Fresh baked bread that either would be unsliced or sliced to the thickness of your choice. I beamed my attention on a butterscotch coffee cake with a beautiful paper lining of gold, like a grand cupcake. "I'll try that," I said to Harry. It was moist and warming to the senses. I think my husband would love that with his morning coffee and milk. Wrap it up. Next, I wandered over to the meat station. Beautiful filet tails, the end of a filet mignon, lamb chops, chicken. I could ask them to remove the skin and tendons that make the breast curl. Dover sole and bacon cured with minimal nitrates. There was a different level of consciousness here, and I liked it. As I was leaving, Harry said, "Would you like to open an account with us?" I said, "Sure." Eliminating the thought of paying for my marketing and just receiving a monthly bill was delightful. I called Deirdre to thank her for telling me about Jurgensen's. This experience opened my eyes to a culinary world I was about to embark on. Channeling my creative energies while I was newly married, pregnant, and for the first time in my life, free from the pressures of my career, linked with my parents, I transferred my love of singing and making music into a new awareness of food and how to prepare it. Then I heard about a place called Every Woman's Village from my new sister-in-law, Roz. She lived in the valley and went to knitting class there. The valley was only a 20-minute drive from where I was living in Beverly Glen Canyon, so I checked into a cooking class. It was a course of 4 classes, 1 a week for a month. I could handle that. My swollen belly was definitely showing by now. I felt a new sense of pride with my new life. Yes, I paid a very high price of retiring from my career. Certainly, I was on very shaky grounds with my parents. Astonishingly, I was confident to have made the right decision and marry Lenny, as well as have a child and commit to raising him full time with no distractions. My first cooking lesson was based around the recipe for chicken Lorraine. Ingredients: 4 chicken breasts boneless, breading, eggs, water, cognac, salt, pepper, Gruyere cheese, thinly sliced ham, pineapple, cubes of sugar. Pineapple, you say? Oh, yes, that was for garnish. First, remove the skin from the chicken breast. Separate into 2 fillets. On the thin strip of each side of the breast, remove the tendon so as not to curl. Second, prepare bowls with egg wash, egg yolk with a splash of cognac and a drop of water. Flour and Parmesan cheese, grated finely, seasoned with salt and pepper. Make an incision in the breast and add a generous slice of Gruyere and 1 piece of thin-sliced baked ham. Lightly dredge in the flour mixture and then the egg wash. Finish in the flour mixture again. Heat up the saucepan with a combination of butter and olive oil at a medium heat. Add several cloves of garlic to flavor the oil and remove after they've created a perfume. Place chicken in pan and fry until golden brown, about 15 minutes on each side. Adjust heat as needed to prevent burning the delicious breading. Before removing chicken from the pan, add a jigger of cognac by placing your thumb over the opening of the bottle and splashing it into the pan. With the other hand, keep a flame starter handy or a lit match to ignite the cognac, hence creating a flambé. Now the chicken is succulently bathing in a delicious sauce of garlic-flavored butter, olive oil, and cognac. And at the very end, squeeze half a lemon over the crisp breading, and voila! You're done. Now the instructor, a chef donned in formal attire, said to his students, "You may prepare this in advance for a dinner party you're having. Just let the fillet cool and wrap them carefully in foil. Pop them in the freezer. For an added touch of drama, you can serve them this way. You'll need a whole pineapple, tin foil, and sugar cubes. Cut away the outer shell of the pineapple and core the middle of it. Slice into 1/2-inch rounds. Place in a sauté pan with butter and caramelize. Flambe with cognac and cool. Wrap carefully the same way and add to freezer. When you're ready to serve, preheat your oven to 425 degrees and bake both the chicken and pineapple for 15 minutes or until completely reheated. Take your tin foil and make it into squares of the width of the roll, approximately 15 by 15. Place pineapple ring in the middle, then 1 fillet chicken breast on top. Mold the foil to emulate a pineapple, and at the top, insert a cube of sugar saturated in cognac. And for the presentation, light the sugar so a blue flame glows from the center, and serve. Well, that's exactly what I did. I prepared the dishes, popped them into the freezer with pineapple slices. Oh, what a joy to be in your own home on a day when you can open the windows and breathe cool air outside mingled with your labor of love inside. One early evening, I was home alone and the phone rang. It was Lenny telling me that his partner, Mo Austin, my former employer, who ran Warner Brothers Reprise Records, and his wife, Evelyn, were coming home for dinner. He asked me if I had anything I could serve, and to my great relief, I told him, "Yes, not only do I have something, but I'm excited to surprise you with a new recipe I learned." He said, "We'll be there by 8:30, and hung up. I preheated the oven at 7:30, took out my frozen gourmet treats and let them get to the room temperature. Then into the oven for several minutes and knock, knock, knock. Hey, my husband's home. My table was set, and the tinfoil pineapples were ready on a serving platter. My home smelled warm and inviting, and now to light the little sugar cubes. My guests were impressed with the meal. I served them that night, and to my delight, it was worth the effort. Bon appetit. Oh, yes, I still have my Julia Child book, and with all the stains on the hollandaise sauce pages, no wonder when my son was born, he had a gourmet appetite. Dr. George Harris, my gynecologist, had also been my mother-in-law's doctor who delivered Lenny. He was the chief of staff at Cedars of Lebanon and had a habit of patting me on my rear as I exited his office. Those days, breastfeeding was frowned upon, so the thought never came to mind. I was told to take a medication to dry up my milk. I followed my doctor's orders, never questioning the options. A great conformity washed over me in this process. Do as I was told. Have an epidural. The spinal injection eases the pain. Another procedure I followed. My mother was absent with any advice, probably stunned from my departure as her pawn. Even though my sister-in-law showed support, she didn't offer any of her own experience as well. I was alone a lot of the time. My husband was either in the studio until 4 a.m. or asleep in our bedroom and did not want to be disturbed. Our house was in a canyon. It got very dark at night. Late in my pregnancy, one of these dark and lonely nights, I received a phone call from a stalker. I had received calls like this one at least 2 previous times. A man's voice saying, "I know you're alone." I looked out of the window of the bathroom next to the bedroom where I was resting around 9 o'clock and saw nothing. This time, I wouldn't cower under the covers until my husband returned home. This time, I fled. I panicked, ran as fast as I could in my condition to the car that was parked in the open carport of our split-level house. I had inherited my mother-in-law's car, a white Cadillac Eldorado. My stomach filled the driver's seat, but I had plenty of room in the Cadillac. Out of the driveway in what felt like steering a boat, winding down our narrow lane to the canyon road and up to Mulholland Drive, where it generally is misty, I drove cautiously until I came to Hollywood, where my husband was working. Lenny was busy mixing a record in the sound booth at Western Studio. The musician space was empty, and so I wandered in to find a place to curl up and sleep. A drum riser with baffle walls insulated the sounds coming from the mixing booth, so I decided to make myself and child at home. I was roused by my husband sometime in the middle of the night, telling me it was time to leave. I followed him home and literally went into labor. That next afternoon, I gave birth to my son Joey.
You got a little boy, yeah, yeah. That's what love is made of. That's what love is made of. Good times begin with Dr. Pepper. Different, Dr. Pepper. Not a cola, not a root beer. A light and lively taste that you'll cheer. Relax, refresh, enjoy it now. It's Dr. Pepper time. The Dr. Pepper difference. Yes,